So I wanted to give a little bit of context with my background so you could understand how I got into ratings and sort of what ratings ultimately means for me. And I trace everything directly back to internships that I had. So thinking about kind of connecting the dots and stepping stones in my life, we really like this image because it sort of is a cross between someone who looks like they really know where they're going and how they're getting there and being on the precipice of falling in and drowning. And that's sort of, I think, probably a reasonably good metaphor for a lot of our careers. But I trace everything back to the first internship that I had. I worked for a Japanese bank that's since been merged about 8 times into one of the few that remain. And my role was in basically the leverage buyout group. So it was the group that was having to invest capital or investing capital into a lot of the large LBOs that were being constructed by the big private equity firms. And I remember, and totally coincidentally, last night I was going through some papers and I found my letter of recommendation from my first boss from my internship. And I have no idea why it was in my dresser, but I found it last night. And I looked at it and I realized all the things that theoretically I did during my internship. And I think he was being pretty generous, actually. But the one thing I do remember is that I used to go to so-called bank meetings with him. And how many here have heard of KKR? All right, so KKR, giant private equity firm, one of the granddaddies of the leverage buyout world, and I was going to meetings with Kohlberg, the first K, and it was right after he split out of KKR and started up his own firm. And I remember the first bank meeting that I went to with this internship, my boss brought me along, and I asked him what I was supposed to do at the meeting. And he said, well, I've got this thing, it's a little bit embarrassing, but I tend to fall asleep a lot. And I went, that's a little weird. And he said, so I want you to sit next to me, and anytime I fall asleep, I want you to kick me and wake me up. So there I was at a table across from Kohlberg, an absolute legend, and my entire job for my internship was to kick my boss so he'd wake up and not be embarrassed. And I do think that's actually the only major thing I accomplished that summer, but it was pretty interesting. So so I finished that internship, which was reasonably simple, and then I was studying Japanese and Asian studies in college. I went to Japan the next year, so that was before my junior year. I ended up in Kyoto studying, and one day I get a phone call from someone I didn't know, and they called into my homestay family, and my homestay mother came and said, they speak English, it's for you. And I picked it up, and the guy on the other end of the phone had an English accent, and he said, I understand from your father that you're eminently bribable, and my colleague and I are in Tokyo this week, and we'd like to come to Kyoto this weekend, and he says that if we buy you all of your meals, you'll show us around. I thought that sounds like a pretty good deal. So I said yes. These two people came down. I ended up spending the weekend with them, showing them around. I was studying economics, so we threw some economics in. We threw some Japanese art history in, the whole bit. And at the end of the weekend, the last meal, they said, "Are you going to go back to that Japanese bank for an internship this summer?" And I said, "Well, I was thinking about it." They said, "Actually, we want you to come work with us." And it turned out that it was one of the vice chairmen of Barclays and the head of international capital markets for Barclays, and they hired me. I ended up working there out of school as well, but my 2 internships were almost entirely coincidental. I don't think I actually accomplished much in the first one. In the second one, I was utterly unsupervised and actually sold a piece of a bond deal, which I absolutely was not supposed to do, clearly. And but regulations and reform have gone a long way since then, so you're probably not going to get stuck ending up doing that. But they seem to like it. It all worked out pretty well. But I then became a banker through this experience at Barclays, and I was a bond guy. So I was arranging financings for international, almost entirely non-U.S., international corporations, financial institutions, and sovereigns. And it was a combination of what we call private placements and registered deals, meaning public bonds. So a lot of what Chris was talking about are things that I've been around for quite some time. But there's a common theme in my early career, and that was ratings. And people would use the rating agencies to get access to the more public market distribution in bond deals, and they'd use the traditional private placement market in many cases as a way of bypassing traditional ratings. I then left because it seemed really exciting to go into the tech world. So I ended up running what was called the Yankee Origination Group for Deutsche Bank, and I left in 2000 because the internet boom was so exciting, and I thought there would be some really interesting things to do there, which there have been. So I left and started to run some private companies. One of the companies that I founded was a small investment banking boutique, and we helped financial technology companies to raise capital and do mergers and acquisitions and things like that. Rapid Ratings was a company that was a prospective client of ours and approached us, asking us to take on a mandate to sell them. And we ended up putting a deal on the table, and we bought the company that would have been our client. Sold a broker-dealer, and I've been running a ratings business since then. So my career path, which I tie back to interns, has had this theme of capital markets and technology, and now finally I've found a home, which is financial technology, using all of the entrepreneurship and all of the banking in sort of one little package. So traditional ratings have been around for an extremely long time. The business model of them has changed slightly, but if you look at this little image on the left here, you'll see that Standard & Poor's is actually a merger of two entities, and the Poor's portion of it, actually, and John Moody's business as well, basically rated railroad bonds. So we're talking about an industry that goes back well over 100 years. Into the mid to late 1800s is really when these businesses started. And much of what they do today is actually very similar to what they did before. A little bit more technology, they do it in greater volume, but they pretty much are doing the same kind of thing, which is evaluating the bonds that Chris was just talking about. They'll evaluate a municipal bond, they'll evaluate a sovereign bond, they'll evaluate a corporate bond. But they are putting a perspective on it, very qualitatively, saying we believe that the default probability of this bond or the loss that one might incur if they invest in this bond will be of X or Y level, and then they apply it to a scale, and that scale is an alpha scale. So you hear things like triple B, single A, double A, triple A. All of those are terms that come in the scale that they provide. In the 1970s, they shifted their business model. They used to be a subscription-based business, meaning it would be the buy side or other users of the ratings that would be paying for the ratings. And in the 70s, they shifted that, and they shifted that very cleverly. There are different reasons they use now to say why they did that. One is the advent of the copy machine and ultimately the internet and the ability to pass information around. All of these are reasons that they point to, but basically it was a lot more lucrative to start charging the companies and the issuers of bonds than it was to charge the subscribers. So now you have a business model for ratings that's called issuer paid. And the issuer paid model is one that has persisted for quite some time. And it is created an embedding effect in the market. So you now have the conflicts of interest that are often talked about in the press that say that if a rating agency is paid by company XYZ, whether it's the emerging market company or it's a U.S. company, that they're going to be favoring that entity. And oftentimes, I think that does happen. That doesn't happen all the time, so it's not like every rating is bad. But it presents a conflict of interest, which is a challenge. And there's a lot of headline value in that conflict. But really what happens is it means that their ratings don't change that much. So the S&Ps and the Moody's of the world do try to give a long-term perspective, which they say is to everyone's benefit by creating a stable rating. The problem with stable ratings is it doesn't necessarily tell you how that issuer's quality is at any point in time, other than this sort of concept of in the future it should continue to be at a certain level. And that I'll show you an example of that in just a second. It's a very qualitative process, so there are vagaries in it. And they're very structurally embedded. I started to talk about that a second ago. There are a lot of investors that have created their investment guidelines that say you have to invest in securities of a certain level by S&P or Moody's, and you can't invest below that. Once you start to have that in the market, which has been going on for quite some time, it's extremely difficult to dislodge that. And market inertia has created this support for S&P and Moody's. So even after S&P pays $1.4 billion out to the Department of Justice in a giant suit for effectively fraud, their business is still doing great. Thank you very much, because a lot of people continue to have to use them and continue to rely on them. The reforms that Congress and that the SEC and that others have tried to implement have actually had unintended consequences, which is interesting. And you take a look at Dodd-Frank, this massive and now very famous, coming up on its 5-year anniversary next week, set of legislation. A lot of the 25 pages of rating agency work actually further support S&P and Moody's by making it more expensive for younger companies to compete with them. So the only companies that can really afford the new legislation are S&P and Moody's. So it really kind of boxes other firms out. Unless you are prepared to innovate and be more creative, which is really why I got excited about Rapid Ratings when we first saw it. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the Rapid Ratings story here, except to say that we are a quantitative firm and we are paid by the companies who use our ratings, not by the companies that we rate. And we rate tens of thousands of private companies and public companies, whether they're bond issuers or not. If we have access to their financial statements, we'll rate them. This puts us in a position where we can compete in a lot of different ways, not having to dislodge S&P and Moody's from the traditional bond users, but we can have companies like an ABB, a giant engineering firm, or we can have a variety of companies that use us in insurance or or broker-dealers or banks using us to understand the risks that they're taking in their investments or in the counterparties that they're taking risk of in one form or another. We are significantly earlier than S&P and Moody's in identifying companies that ultimately fail. And in one of the testimonies, and had the privilege, I think it is, of testifying to Congress 4 times, in the SEC a few times. And one of the times I sat next to the chief credit officer from Moody's, and I got to say in my preamble that there's academic literature that had just come out that says that we're 3 years ahead of Moody's in identifying companies that ultimately fail. And, you get this sort of squirm in the seat next to me, which is sort of a lot of fun. But, we are much, much faster, and we are identifying risks that they can't, just because of the way they go about their process is extremely different than ours. This is a graphical demonstration of where on our 100-point scale companies that fail end up, down in the high risk and the very high risk zones. And a lot of the customers that we have really focus on this type of data. But it was MF Global where we met the folks from John Lothian, and this is just a good example. The lines that you see at the top show S&P, Moody's, and Fitch ratings on MF Global. And MF Global, for those of you who don't know, is a massive failure. It's one of the largest bankruptcies in U.S. corporate history. And it was a firm that was very active in the commodities and futures space. And John Corzine, who used to be the head of Goldman Sachs and then governor of New Jersey and senator, he became the CEO. And the issuer paid portion of the rating agencies meant that the management of MF Global had a lot of control over and influence over S&P and Moody's opinions because they thought, wow, this is great, this fantastic rock star is coming in to run this firm, even though the firm was basically deteriorating out from under them. So our ratings continued to decline significantly over time, showing a lot of high risk early warning, a couple of years of early warning, whereas S&P, Moody's, and Fitch just continued to have this stable rating right until the time that the company failed and filed for bankruptcy. A couple of the things that I just wanted to wrap up on are, I think about the market that I'm in, I think about the business that I'm with now, and I see a tie back to the original things that I was doing as an intern and as an early career banker full-time. And I never would have sat there at that time and looked forward and said, well, I know that I'm going to go do that. I had an idea of what the general pathway was that I wanted to have, but all I knew was I wanted to be in business. I didn't know I wanted to be this, or the banker that I was, or anything along the way. And I think it's important to, as you're going from internship, or while you're completing your internships over the next, whatever it is, 6 weeks or so, going into your first, job hunt, it's important to think about where you want to be, but you can't over-prescribe it. And in this job market, which is not easy, you may need to take a circuitous path to get to where you want to be. You may not be able to get the absolute perfect job the first job out. You may get something that's close to it. But think about the steps 2, 3, and 4 steps down the road. Think about where you ultimately want to be, and that you want to be setting yourself up with experiences that can let you get to where you want to be, even if you can't jump right out of school into it. And the dots kind of connect themselves over time. You will end up in a place where you look back and you say, all of those things made sense, basically, but you were setting yourself up for it. As long as you're prepared to innovate with your own career, prepared to innovate and be creative in the things that you do, and take advantage of the person who calls you and says, I know your father, or I know somebody who you went to school with, or it's an opportunity that comes out of the blue, and I don't think anyone should feel ashamed about using connections and opportunities that they see come along and seize on them and help them to mold where you're going. And the last sort of advice I would give is make sure that during your internships you're speaking to your bosses, your sponsors, about what you need to get out of it. Make sure you say to them, when I go back to school, if I don't have this and this, it's going to be worse for me. I really wish that I could have this and this and say I got these experiences, or that I want to have this on my resume. I'd be that blunt about it. Because if we as sponsors of interns are not in a position to give you what you want and to get from you what we need during the summer, then it's not as good a relationship as it can be. And if your boss really just wants you to kick them under the table, kick them under the table and then make sure they write you a good letter. I'll be here afterwards if anyone wants to talk more about ratings.